What's your problem, lady? That's what I would have liked to have called this lesson, but instead we called it Be Careful, Be Thankful, keeping with the Thanksgiving theme. And who is this Michael that looks out her window and despises David, this biblical hero to some of us? He had his flaws and pitfalls, but he was a king. Who is she to look out the window and despise him in her heart? So in order to get some background on it, we're going to go back and figure out who Michael is. And I'm calling her Michael because that's what the audio on my Bible app said. So if that's not right, forgive me for that. But I'm talking about a person that's described twice in the reading that Gordon read, 2 Samuel chapter 6. She's described as Saul's daughter. So you students of the Old Testament realize that Saul and David, there's contention there. The Bible calls Saul David's enemy, even though David has a respect for Saul, but Saul's been trying to kill David for a long time. And when leadership passed from Moses to Joshua, it was pretty seamless. God told Moses, Joshua's the guy to replace me. Moses told the people, and it was Moses died, Joshua took over, and we went on from there. But for God to rip the kingdom out of Saul's possession and hand it to David was a bloodbath, a lot of violence, and it took years. Some scholars say 10 years. What's interesting is Israel decided they didn't want God to fight their battles anymore. They asked for a king. So God gave them what they asked for. He gave them Saul, their king. And he was doing well, but then he was commanded, I want you to utterly destroy the Amalekites. They did Israel wrong hundreds of years ago. God remembered, and it was time to judge them. He said, kill everybody, men, women, children, infants, and destroy all their stuff. I don't want to see anything left. And Saul did not obey that command. He did not kill the king, and he did not destroy all the best things from Israel, or from the Amalekites. And God was so angry with him, he says, I'm going to rip the kingdom right out of your hand, and I'm doing it today. But that played out for 10 years with a violent turnover to David's kingdom. And even though it took 10 years, we immediately find out who God has a better person in mind, and we immediately find out who it is. It's David. And he's a lowly in his own family. And Saul loves David because he's his armor bearer, and he has an evil spirit, and David plays music and soothes his soul. And Saul and David are very close initially. But eventually, as you know, David comes and he sees the Philistine, Goliath, and Israel's completely terrified of Goliath. Nobody wants to kill him. They're afraid of him, and Saul offers a reward for killing him. It's going to be great riches from the king, nobility for the family. The family can live for free. They don't owe the king any money. And he's going to give him his daughter in marriage to whoever kills the Philistine. Well, David kills the Philistine, and Saul's pride gets the best of him. As they return from that, women come out and said, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. And immediately from that point on, the relationship sours. And Saul has suspicion on David, and he wants to kill him. David keeps his humility for marrying one of Saul's daughters. He actually refuses. He doesn't think he's good enough to marry the daughter. He has picked out the oldest daughter, Merab. But Saul has something else in mind. He wants to kill David, but he doesn't want to do the dirty work himself. So he says, you know what, I'll give my youngest daughter, Michal's, hand in marriage to you if you kill 100 Philistines. Well, David's happy with that. Saul expects the Philistines to conquer David and kill him, but David kills 200, and Michal and David get married. And that only worsens the problem for Saul. Now Saul feels like he has to do the dirty work himself, and Saul decides he's going to kill David when Michal and David are together. Michal finds out about it, and she helps him escape out the window, and then Saul comes up to kill David, and she is pulled off the ultimate deception that became a Hollywood staple for our favorite movies in the thriller genre, when the victim, the intended victim, is asleep in bed, and the person with a murderous intent comes in to kill him. There's no way this person can escape. They're sound asleep, and they pull back the covers, and they're not there. It's a big pile of clothes. Well, Michal pulled that off, and Saul is enraged. How dare you take sides with David over me? And that's the last we see from Michal and David. We don't see them together in the account that we read, but later on in 1 Samuel chapter 25, we see that over a course of time that Michal has married somebody else, and David has married 2 other women and had children. So it seems to be over with the marriage there. It's a sad. It's sad that Michal was used as a pawn by her father, and now she's lost her love because now David's on the run and from Saul trying to kill him. So let's go. Let's read this exchange of words of Michal and David. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 18. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both the men and women, a cake of bread and one of dates and one of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his own house. But when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of the servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself." Now, so David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me ruler of all the people of the Lord over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. But with the maids of whom you have spoken with, them I will be distinguished." How sad that somehow these two have now have become enemies. And the reason for that is when Saul and Jonathan, David's best friend, Saul's son Jonathan, were killed, there was a coming together by the house of Saul. Abner decided that he would bring the kingdom under David. So when he presented that idea to David, David said, "You know what, that sounds good to me, but I want you to bring Michal with you." He wanted to heal this horrible thing that happened to both of them. He wanted to fix this injustice in his life. He had killed 100 Philistines for this woman that loved him so much, and he wanted to bring her back. But the problem was she was already married. So when Abner brought Michal to David, her husband that she was currently married to was behind them crying. So you can see where she's getting this hatred for David now, because she already has a husband that loves her, and now she's being pulled apart from her. And when she gets to David, he has multiple wives and many children with those wives. So our first point: be careful, watch what you say. I think all of us would agree that Michal was her circumstances she may not have brought on herself. She was forced in a corner. She was used as a pawn by Saul. David took her away from a husband that loved her. Even though she may have thought that was over between her and David, she was ripped apart and brought back to David, and not to be the only wife in his life, but to be one of many. Imagine that. How would you feel if you didn't have any control of your life, that when you fall in love with somebody, your father's trying to kill them, and when things are finally starting to heal and you're starting to overcome the pain of that now David rips out the scab wide open and now is bringing you back to relive that. Jesus said in Matthew 15:18, "But the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man." Michal didn't have a reason, or she had a reason to hate David, but it didn't give her the license to pour gasoline on the fire. Let's look at how she approached David. When David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. She had a zinger in mind that she was going to give him, but she couldn't wait for him to get through the door. She had to go out and meet him and try to ruin his day. How the king of Israel distinguished himself today. She probably thought that this is going to ruin his day, that he would be tongue-tied, and that he would not be able to answer her. But David's a psalmist. He's eloquent in his rebuke of her. "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. But with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished." Man, that must have felt so good to have that zinger ready to bring him down, but it didn't turn out that way. She didn't get the benefit that she thought she would. And then you have this verse that immediately follows that verse. "Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." That suggests to me that there was a consequence that lasted a long time here. A woman to be barren in Israel was never the Lord's intent. There was an absence of blessing from God here. And as she was one of many wives, who was she confiding in on her dark days? She had had a rough life. She would have no daughter that would see the best in her, no son that would be her champion when things were bad in her old age. Let's try not to make things worse. If we've identified an enemy or somebody that has hurt us and we're emotional about our past with them, let's be careful about what we say. Consider James 1:26. "If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless." Be careful, watch what you say. Our second point, treat the brethren with reverence. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and as you know, Israel is moving the ark. This is the second attempt. The first attempt, the Ark of the Covenant's been in the house of Abinadab for 20 years, and they put it on a cart and they're starting to move it. And as we all know, one of Abinadab's sons, Uzzah, the oxen stumbled and it was on the cart. It looked like the Ark of the Covenant was going to fall on the ground, and Uzzah put his hand up to keep that from happening, and God struck him down for his irreverence. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is pretty cool. It's called furniture, but it's God's furniture. It was belonged in the tabernacle, and that's where they were trying to move it to. It was about almost 4 feet long, about 2 feet high, and 2 feet wide, and overlaid with pure gold inside and out, and it had rings where you could carry it. You put poles in it that were covered in gold, and that's how it was meant to be carried, and only Levites were allowed to carry it. And there was the things of God in it. There was a pot of manna, the manna which God provided, that Israel complained about. He sustained them in the wilderness, but God fed Israel. 2 stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments. Israel did not want to listen to God, but he still gave them commandments. He still allowed them to enter in the covenant relationship with him. And also had Aaron's rod that would bud. Aaron showed poor leadership at times, but God still gave him something wonderful to lead his people. And it says in here that they brought it, once Uzzah died, that they brought it to the house of Obed-Edom. Verse 9, so David was afraid of the Lord that day after Uzzah died. How can the ark of the Lord come to me? David asked the Lord questions all the time, and the Lord would respond. This time the Lord did not respond. He had already told him how to carry that ark. And David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now you can imagine Obed-Edom having this Ark of the Covenant. This represents God's desire to be with Israel. And everything about their history. This Ark of the Covenant was carried around the walls of Jericho. It was with them in the wilderness. I wonder, where did they put this in the house? Is this in the basement to keep the children away and keep people away from enjoying it? Or is it in a room with one door that they would trim the oil lamps at dusk or at night, and the whole room would turn glimmer in gold, and they would talk about how God was always faithful to Israel and how unfaithful Israel could be at times, but God never let them go. And it says in here, thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now, if we let God into our lives for 3 months, reading his word and discussing God, his faithfulness, and how much we need to trust him, and with an honest understanding about where we are and our faithfulness, would our spiritual growth be any different than Obed-Edom's blessing here after being 3 months with the Ark of the Covenant? We find out what that blessing was. Maybe not all the blessings, but Obed-Edom had a lot of children, and those children had a lot of children, and that scriptures say that indeed he was blessed. But what were the other blessings? Does this mean that every woman, or every adult female in the house was pregnant? Cattle? This isn't King David sitting around wondering how the Ark of the Covenant's doing. In verse 12 it says, now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the Ark of God. This was newsworthy. And I think when we read our Bible for 3 months and pray, that our transformation would be noticeable. It would be newsworthy as well. We know one thing, too. They treated that Ark of the Covenant with reverence. I'm going to read one of Jesus' parables. Matthew 18:21. Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Then Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. So the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him the debt. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him and began to choke him, saying, pay back what you owe. So his fellow slave fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you." But he was unwilling and went and threw him in prison until he should pay back what was owed. So when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to their Lord all that had happened. Then summoning him, his Lord said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you?" And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. There's two things that make this parable scary to me. One is the unmerciful slave did not have the means to repay. He was completely dependent on God's or the king's mercy and forgiveness of the debt. The second one, this blows away the once saved, always saved false teaching. He had forgiveness of the debt, and then he lost it. He lost it when he treated somebody else unmercifully. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And his Lord, in verse 34, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. And when David found out that Saul and Jonathan were killed, he found out because somebody delivered the news to him. It was an Amalekite, the same group, a member of the same tribe that Saul was supposed to wipe out, showed up, and he was a scavenger or an opportunist. He had the king's crown, Saul's crown, and he had his bracelet with him. And he thought he had good news. He thought he had something to offer the king. The king was not impressed. He said, "Where are you from?" And he told him he was an Amalekite, and David had him killed. When we win our battle of words with the brothers and sisters in Christ, or figuratively speaking, have a dagger where we stab one of us in the back, are these not spoils of war? We have to be careful that we don't make God an enemy by the way we treat each other. We have to have mercy for each other and make sure that we're not storing up God's wrath against us. We have to treat the brethren with reverence. And the final point, be thankful for the family of God. First John 4:11 says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." That word ought suggests a moral obligation to love one another. And when I see that word ought, that puts things in the negative for me. It's like, oh, here's something else I have to do, or here's something I'm not good at, or here's something I'm going to have to apologize for. That's really a poor way of looking at this. Christ purchased the church with his blood. It's his church, and it's not a burden for us. A fellowship should be something fantastic and something we look forward to and something that's necessary. It's not something that I need to feel burdened by. Most of you know that I am a football fan. My favorite team is doing really well this year. They're winning. They had a trade deadline pass a couple of weeks ago. That's when the losing teams get rid of a player that for a draft pick that might help them out in the future. And the winning teams have flaws, but they pick up somebody that's useful and puts them over the top, and maybe they can win it all. The trade deadline came and went, and my team did nothing. They didn't add anybody. And they asked the coach, "Why is that?" And they said, "Well, I'm happy with the guys we have." What a great attitude for us to have. Be thankful for the folks that are here. I ought to remember when my mom died, what you guys did for me. You guys were there for me. I ought to remember that a lot of people have invested a lot of time and energy in my spiritual growth, because if I had done it all by myself, my life would be a lot different on Monday through Saturday, and I wouldn't be much more than a hypocrite. I would just be putting on a show here on Sunday. I have a long way to go, but with your guidance, I'm in a better spot now. it's very easy to, as we've been together for years, some of us, I've been here 11 years, so my flaws are completely evident. And but if we see the best in each other, we're in a better spot. Jesus built this church so that he could have his mission fulfilled. And I thank you for your time. Well, before we sing a song, if there's any prayer requests or if there's any questions you want answered in the Bible, please come forward and we'll hopefully help you. Thank you.